Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to our very first investor briefing of 2021. As is customary for about 20 years now, we have with us from the Ministry of Finance and Public Service, the Dr. Honorable Nigel Clarke, MP, Minister of Finance and Public Service. The Minister will begin with a review of the Jamaican economy for the tumultuous year that was 2020 and an outlook for 2021. We encourage viewers to post their questions on social media and remember to tag us with the hashtag #MILInvestorForum. We'll also be featuring a market segment on current affairs, so be sure to stick around until the end of the program. I'll take this moment to remind you that if you're seeking to expand your portfolio or embark on your first investment, Mayberry can guide you in achieving your financial goals. Follow us on social media and visit our website at www.mayberryinv.com to learn more. Our social media handles include our YouTube channel, Instagram, and other social media platforms. At this point in time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Honorable Nigel Clarke to our program. Welcome, Dr. Clarke.
Thank you for having me.
Also, I'd like to welcome our CEO, Gary Parrott, and our Chairman, Christopher Berry, who joins us online. Dr. Honorable Nigel Clarke is Jamaica's Minister of Finance and the Public Service. He's a Member of Parliament for St. Andrew Northwestern. He has served as an Ambassador of Economic Affairs, where he represented Jamaica's interests with the multilateral institutions, and as a Senator in the upper house of the Jamaican Parliament between 2013 and 2015. Minister Clarke also wears the hat of social entrepreneur. He's the founding chairman of the National Youth Orchestra of Jamaica, an organization that operates for music and socially channeled programs at the 8 centers in Kingston and Spanish Town. Lastly, Minister Clarke is the recipient of the PSOJ's 50 Under 50 Business Leader Award, as well as the Kwanian's Community Service Award. Today, the Minister will be giving us an overview of the Jamaican economy in 2020. He will also be sharing his outlook for the economy in 2021. And I'd like to welcome him again for joining us. Welcome again, Nigel. And I note that we didn't share your illustrious private sector career, which I won't bore the public with, but he's also quite the accomplished businessman.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for having me. And I'm very happy to see that in the midst of the pandemic, Mayberry continues with its traditions, going 20 years now for a forum focused on the economy at this time in the year. And I'm happy as Minister of Finance to continue that tradition in accepting the invitation here this afternoon. Because as much as the pandemic is here, life must go on and the economy must continue. I want to reserve more of my time this evening for the Q&A segments, so I'm going to just quickly just go through some highlights on the Jamaican economy for the year 2020. And we begin with just an overview of the fiscal accounts of the government. The fiscal accounts are integral to the functioning and the performance of the economy. We'd have started the year in March prior to the onset of the pandemic in Jamaica, or certainly prior to the first case of COVID in Jamaica, and we tabled and passed a budget that envisioned expenditure of $853.46 billion. The pandemic hit, and that budget had to be revised in May of 2020, and expenditure we reduced to $838 billion. By September, we were running ahead of target, and expenditure was increased to $853.7 billion. And just yesterday, we tabled a third supplementary estimate with expenditure of $850 billion. What I want to highlight here is that expenditure has remained on track. Expenditure, if you could go back to the previous slide, expenditure has remained unchanged despite the pandemic, with no new net borrowing. And that is, you can go on to the next slide, that is significant, that we've been able to keep the expenditure profile of the government intact in spite of the worst crisis in 100 years, with no new net borrowing, even while revenues have declined precipitously, as the next slide will show. So despite the fact that revenues for the 9 months ending December 31st, 2020, declined by $71 billion as compared to the previous year. So the expenditure profile of the government has remained intact with no new borrowing, with revenues declining by $71 billion. That's something for us to, an achievement for us to be able to celebrate. And the only reason, just moving on, why we've been able to do that is that we started the year with an opening cash balance of over 4% of GDP and well over $80 billion. We had accumulated that in order to make a big payment on debt. That's what we were planning to do, to reduce the debt dramatically. And so we had accumulated balances from fiscal overperformance, and a fiscal overperformance is setting a target at X and overachieving that target. And we had overachievement certainly for the last 3 or 4 fiscal years. In addition, we had just sold our shares in Wigton, courtesy of Mayberry, who represented us in what was a record transaction. We were able to refinance that debt, and that took in another $5 or $6 billion. We sold Trans-Jamaica and got about 13 or 14 billion from that. And we were able to reintegrate public bodies into their parent ministries. We did away with the PCJ structure, and at that time, PCJ only had one subsidiary, which was Petrojam. It made no sense to have a superstructure that held $6 billion in deposits. So we were able to do away with that structure. That $6 billion came in. When you added it all up, we had over $80 billion to start the year with, which we were able to use to cushion the impact. The fiscal buffers also included the fact that we've been maintaining a high primary balance over a number of years. And running a high primary balance, our achievement in the last fiscal year was 7.1%, even though the target was 6.5%. That provides you with room for adjustment without having too much of a deleterious effect on the overall sustainability of the government's finances. And of course, debt was at 20-year lows. So in the utilization of that opening cash balance, it's akin to saying, having a line of credit that you can draw down on quickly, but in this case, the line of credit was our own cash. Now, while expenditure remained in the same ballpark, changing from $853 billion in the original budget to $850 billion in the third supplementary table yesterday, the composition of expenditure changed significantly, as you'd expect in a pandemic. We had expenditure which entailed a large social and economic program, the largest social program in Jamaica's history, the CARE program, where we provided unemployment and other support to persons who were affected by the pandemic, as well as to occupational groups who could not work at the same pace or rate due to the lockdown in the economy. We also were, we were also able to, on the previous slide, increase COVID support to the Ministry of Health and Wellness in the tune of several $1 billion, and support of public bodies who were affected by the pandemic, their normal revenue flows, public bodies such as the National Water Commission that received a lot of its revenues from the tourism sector, bodies such as the UDC, where their major earning asset is in the tourism sector, and tourism, and bodies such as PICA, the Passport, Immigration and Citizens Agency, which derives much of its fees and income from persons applying for passports. We had to supplement those public bodies with billions of dollars. Now, when you put the new expenditure together, we're talking about $50 billion of new expenditure. So while we're saying the expenditure remained unchanged, largely speaking, the envelope of expenditure at around $850 billion, the components, we had to do a lot of shifting around, but keeping everything within the same envelope and financed by our cash balance and by our ability to move the primary balance. Now, we suspended fiscal rules for 2020, as you'll recall, and again, that's a flexibility that's inbuilt into our fiscal responsibility legislation. We're able to reset the primary balance for this year at 3%. It was originally at 5.4%. 4% in the budget. Our debt to GDP is expected to increase to 103% in March 2021, and that's largely on account of the contraction in the economy. Debt sustainability is still important, and therefore the correction mechanism lifts the primary balance target to 5.4% next year. Now, I just have this slide here. Unfortunately, you probably can't read it at home, but what the slide does is it shows Jamaica's fiscal accounts in the context of what is happening in the Western Hemisphere. So it's broken down into North America, Central America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. And if you could see the slide, what you'd see is that across the region, the fiscal accounts of all governments have been completely hammered by this crisis. Countries like Jamaica and Grenada, however, who would have gone through massive adjustments in their economies, have been able to absorb the crisis while still keeping a positive primary balance. There's a few other countries in the region who have been able to do that. And if you can see the chart, you'll see where the debt statistics are across the region. And our region of the Caribbean islands, represents the region in our hemisphere with, by far, the highest sort of debt outturns as a result of this crisis and as a result of the state going into the crisis. Debt, way across 100%, and in many cases 110%. Moving on to look at another element, the element of growth, which is a central element, I know, for the investing community of persons here at the Mayberry Forum. Just looking at quarterly growth over the past 23 years, and you'll recall that we only started to measure growth quarterly in 1997. Before that, growth was just done on an annual basis. And you'll see that what we've experienced this year is out of proportion to anything that we have ever experienced in our lifetimes, and indeed over the time that quarterly growth figures have been recorded. You'll see in the middle of the chart the decline that we suffered during the global financial crisis, which you will remember was the worst financial crisis at the time since the Great Depression. And that appears as a drop in the bucket compared to what we've experienced this year. The decline in 2009 was, the worst quarterly decline was a decline of just over 4%. This year, you already know that the economy declined by 18% in the first quarter ended June 2020. We rebounded somewhat, and in the second quarter, the decline was just over 10%, and we expect to have a decline for the entire year of somewhere between 10 and 12%, somewhere in the region of 11% when you average it all out. So here, when you look at the composition, however, you'll see that there's a deviation between the goods producing and the services sector, where the brunt of the hit as far as growth is concerned is in services. And for better or for worse, services represents 75% of the Jamaican economy. We like to think we have services that are domestic, everything from retail and wholesale and the mechanic shop. Services that you walk in and purchase something. And that segment of the economy is the largest component of the economy. It's about 20% of the economy. We also have services that are geared towards export, services such as tourism, such as BPO and other services. In the first quarter of the year, services declined by over 20%, led by tourism, which declined by over 80%. In the second quarter, tourism declined by 65%, which is an improvement over the first quarter, and services overall declined by 13%. Interestingly, the goods producing sector registered a huge rebound in the second quarter, led by construction, where the decline was only 3.5%, and I say only 3.5%, whereas historically the lowest until now was just over 4%. But only 3.5% in the context, it's extraordinary, I would say, and led by a rebound in construction, which grew by 7% in the quarter ending September, which is a very positive sign. It's one of the few things that we have control over in terms of not having social distancing affected, and it provides a window into the underlying vitality in the economy that's only been disturbed by our inability to freely associate in a way that does not involve social distancing. Now, again, I had a slide here, which unfortunately you may not be able to read at home, but it provides the regional context for Jamaica's growth figures. And what you'll see here, we have again North America, South America, the Caribbean, and Central America. And again, you'll see that the Caribbean is a region by far with the biggest growth impact from the crisis. We're seeing in our region of Caribbean island states that economies are projected to, and by the way, these charts are courtesy of the IMF, an IMF report on the Western Hemisphere. But yeah, in the Caribbean region, we're seeing where economies are slated to decline by 15, 17, 18, and even 20%. Jamaica is at the lower end of the spectrum with the exclusion of Haiti. Haiti, which doesn't have a huge tourism sector, is projected to decline by in the region of 5% for this year. But the rest of the Caribbean region, Jamaica declining at between 10 and 12%, is at the lower end of the spectrum. And that's simply because we're less exposed to tourism than some of our regional counterparts. The other thing this slide shows, however, is the impact on our current account. And I will talk about that in a few slides later, but this gives a comparative chart. Jamaica was running current account deficits that were modest leading up to this crisis. In the 2 years before the crisis, our current account deficits were in the region of 2%, which is quite modest and very ably financed by foreign direct investment. As a result of that modest current account deficit in this crisis, the deterioration will take us somewhere in the region of maybe 5%, 6%, or thereabouts, which is manageable as long as the crisis does not, the pandemic rather, does not last in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. When you compare, however, the current account deficit of 5% or between 5 and 7% that we expect for this year, and you compare it to what has been experienced in the region, where it's been projected current account deficits of 20% and 18% and 15% and 17% and very large financing gaps, you begin to understand how well Jamaica is doing in this crisis. Moving on from growth to look at another segment or another way in which we can view 2020, and I look at it through the prism of unemployment. Jamaica achieved record growth in employment figures over the past 4 years. It took us 4 years to add 100,000 jobs to the economy, which brought unemployment to a historic record low, never before achieved, of 7.2% in October of 2019. But it only took 4 months for all of those gains to be erased and for the economy to shed 130,000 jobs. Now, most of those jobs were in the service sector. As I mentioned, services was the part of the economy that was hardest hit, and most of those jobs were in the elementary occupational groups, service workers, shop and market sales workers. And in this regard, this crisis differs substantially from the global financial crisis, where the nature of the impact was different in that all segments of the society experienced job losses, the executive, the managerial, and so forth. It didn't make it, obviously, it didn't mute the effect of the crisis, but it's just a different type of effect. The effect we're seeing here is a massive hit to growth, massive hit to services, huge hit to employment, but concentrated in occupational groups that are in the service economy. And this is the reason why the government set about introducing, even though a lot of investors probably would say, why is the government, is giving away money to people? It was an imperative. This was something that we had to do. And we put in place the largest social program to address the impact that persons were feeling from the hit to unemployment. Now, just moving on, putting it, here, just showing you in a chart, this is what the employment figures look like over the past 13 years. We lost a lot of jobs in the global financial crisis. We lost 100,000 jobs, and you'll see from the chart, it took us 10 years to get those jobs back. We have again lost 100,000 jobs. You'll see a sharp rebound there. The figures came out for unemployment ending October 2020, and we're happy to report that though July's unemployment shot up from 7.3% in January of 2020 to 12.7% by the end of July, at the end of October, unemployment improved to 10 to just over 10%, which is very good news to have that kind of quick rebound, which we are confident will continue. Just moving. So when you look at the unemployment rate, you'll see and this chart on the y-axis, it starts at 6% and it goes up to 15 or 16, coming from January 2013, when unemployment, or somewhere around March 2013, when unemployment was at 16%, came all the way down to 7.2% in October 2019, 7.3% in January of 2020, shot up to 12.7% in July due to the pandemic, and we have seen a dramatic improvement just announced today, hot off the press, where unemployment as of October 2020 was at 10.7%, an improvement over the prior quarter. Now, looking at another prism, just look at through the trade prism, the economy in 2020, we'll see here, and this is a very interesting sort of segment through which to view the economy. We had remittance inflows, which increased by over 23%, or $400 million, when you look at the period January to December 2020, and you compare it with January to December 2019. At the same time, tourism receipts declined significantly by approximately $2 billion, and that's what we're projecting for the fiscal year ending March 31st. So that hasn't all happened yet, but for the fiscal year ended March 31st. And I use the sign greater than 2 billion because obviously we don't have the precise figure at this time. However, when you look at the trade in goods, there's a $1 billion improvement in the trade in goods balance. Now, that's not necessarily for good reason. The reason why that has happened is because we have a pandemic and we have a compression, particularly in the tourism sector, which is a huge consumer of imports. And we have to do something about that. We definitely have to do something about that and ensure that the tourism sector is much more integrated into the Jamaican economy, and so the economy benefits more from the tourism product. But from this chart, you'll see, and these are the figures for January to August 2020, but there's every indication that the trend continues. For January to August 2019, imports were $4.3 billion. For the comparative period, January to August 2020, imports declined by $1.3 billion. There was a similar decline in exports, as of course, businesses were affected. That decline, though, was much less significant in dollar terms of about $300 million. And so on a net basis, we had an improvement in our trade balance of about $1 billion. Now, you put it all together, remittances improving by $400 million for the full year, a trade balance improving by $1 billion. Here we're talking about 8 months, not for the full year. And you have $2 billion thereabouts decline in tourism for the full fiscal year. You get an idea that there are effects and counterbalances, and the economy has been able to maintain its stability and reserve adequacy through all of this. Now, the figures published by the central bank on FX reserves provide a testimony to this. And if you can see this chart on your screens, what you'll see here are net international reserves from February 2016 to December, I believe, to December of 2020. And if you were to put a blindfold on and come into this room and ask, which period of this graph did Jamaica experience the worst economic crisis in 100 years? And you ask somebody to pinpoint the period, find it for me on this graph, you would not be able to accurately pinpoint it because it's not reflected on this graph. Through the worst crisis in 100 years, we have maintained reserve adequacy, and our net international reserves remains in the region of the highest levels that we have had, in the region of just over $3 billion. And that is on account of the policy choices that we've made. And the policy choice is to ensure that we have reserve adequacy because that is what provides stability, and tools in ensuring reserve adequacy are having the central bank target inflation as its objective and having a nominal exchange rate that operates according to market forces. So we preserve the underlying stability of the Jamaican economy. Now, if we put on this chart the impact on reserves during the global financial crisis, you'll see something entirely different. What you'd see there is a precipitous fall in reserves. Precipitous fall. Even though we only had a 4.5% quarterly decline at that time, and here we're comparing with an 18.4% decline followed by a 10.4% decline. Now, the only way that is possible to have a worse decline but a better outcome is due to policy choice that you have supported and that I would ask that you continue to support regardless of political administration in place, that Jamaica prioritizes macroeconomic stability for the long term, because that ultimately that supports employment and that supports investment. Now, when you look, this is a chart that's interesting, but if you think about what I've preserved, it will be intuitively obvious that when you project our gross reserves in weeks of goods and services imports, interestingly, during the pandemic, during the worst crisis in 100 years, we have more reserves expressed in terms of weeks of goods and services imports than we have ever had in our history. Here I'm just showing 4 years, okay? But if you can download the charts from the BOJ yourself, you'll see that at over 38 weeks of imports, since those charts have been put in place, we have not had reserves representing such a large quantity of imports since those charts were created. And that is in part due to the fact that imports are down, and they're down by 1.3 billion. But it's also due to the fact that reserves are near their highest levels that we've ever had. So we have been able to absorb the crisis. The effects, you can't do away with the effects of growth being compressed and unemployment being declining. But what you want to make sure is that those forces do not destabilize your economy. And what we've been able to do for 2020 is to absorb those forces, to take the punch in the gut. But the abdominal muscles are strong. And we have absorbed those punches. And we are finishing the round 2020, standing tall and ready for round 2021. And as we go into round 2021, I'll just leave with this slide, that having preserved and maintained macroeconomic stability through the worst crisis in 100 years, where we have maintained fiscal and debt sustainability, we've maintained price stability, we've maintained reserve adequacy, and though I have not gone into details on the last one, we have maintained financial sector stability. And what we have to do now and into the future is to ensure that we maintain these so we can provide the foundation for the rebound that we expect in 2021. And as we do so, my final slide is that we continue to build and strengthen institutions, the independence of the central bank, an independent fiscal commission, launching a public investment map which gives great transparency to the government's accounts, where any person can go on a website and view the entire capital program of the government of Jamaica, and over 80 projects are uploaded that you can scrutinize for yourself. Are they on time? Are they over budget? You can upload photographs of the bridges that are to be constructed or roads to be repaired, and therefore hold your representatives to account and your bureaucrats as well. We just launched an open government initiative last week, where again we're deepening transparency in government, and the microcredit legislation passed the House of Representatives last night, bringing a huge sector that's responsible for access to finance into the regulatory ambit to improve access to finance for over 100,000 Jamaicans. I'll stop with that for now. And again, thank you to my hosts at Mayberry.
Thank you, Minister Clark, for that very comprehensive presentation. I'm obviously very impressed with the work of the administration and their friend Nigel, who I think is the greatest Minister of Finance Jamaica's ever seen, and I mean that wholeheartedly. We didn't get a chance to talk about still very relatively low interest rates, which again your policy supports, still great liquidity in the market, in the capital markets, We didn't talk about inflation. We've had relatively low levels of inflation, again, despite having the highest level of the worst pandemic that Jamaica has ever faced. And I think it's just a result of the good fiscal discipline and prudence over the last 7 years. With that, I want to go straight into the questions, Minister, if you don't mind.
Sure.
We've got a few questions for you. The first one speaks to the fact that given the prolonged and increasing impact of the pandemic, do you think there will be a need for more grants and relief packages as a coping mechanism?
Right. Thank you for that question. We continue to assess. We responded because of the sharpness of the pandemic. I mean, the losses were quick. They came hard. Over 130,000 jobs in 4 months, and so we had to respond. We will continue to assess and make decisions that are consistent with those assessments.
Very good, very good. And we've talked a bit about growth. Certainly for the fiscal period ending March 2021, the central bank projects that the economy will contract by 10 to 12%, as you mentioned in your presentation, and is forecasting growth within the range of 3 to 8% for the next fiscal year. Would you say these growth projections are realistic, or are they too optimistic given the current global economic environment and the fact that Jamaica has not achieved 3% growth in 20 years?
Thank you for that question, Dan. Those projections are not only coming from the BOJ, they're coming from the BOJ, from the Planning Institute of Jamaica, from the IDB, the CDB, and the IMF. They are very realistic. And the biggest indicator of that, Dan, is something I mentioned in the presentation, where we saw construction in the middle of the pandemic grow by 7% to the quarter ended September. And that's a quarter where the government's contribution to construction was quite muted because we would have cut our capital budget. So, that's just an indication of what is happening. The nature of this economic decline is not a result of any structural deficiencies in Jamaica or elsewhere that we have imported. It is a result of the fact that we are unable to go about our business, right, without social distancing. And so the fact that we are all stationary, your chairman is stationary and can't even join on screen, okay? We are stationary and can't move around, and that has suppressed economic activity. As long as we can, as the Minister of Health announced yesterday, roll out our vaccine program beginning April of 2021, and our markets to the north continue with their vaccine rollout, I'm confident that the projections of all of those entities will be met. I mean, will absolutely be met. I'm confident about that.
Excellent. That's encouraging to hear. Very encouraging. Chairman Berry. Love to hear a question from you.
Okay. So, my question would be, -10 plus 3, that's still a minus. How long do you think it will take us to get back to where we were at the beginning of 2020? And are there any major policy shifts that you plan to implement that will put us on? We had difficulty staying at 3 before, that will move us to a higher level of growth. Thank you.
Okay, so as an investor, Chris, you know that two things matter: position and direction. If I were to use a little math, I'd say every vector is described by a position and a direction, okay? So yes, our position may be that we are 10% down on 2019, but for 2021, the direction is unmistakably positive, and that matters. As you know, in the investing world, people invest based on direction, based on projection, based on where you're going. And so the good news is that all of those agencies who have made forecasts, the expectation that the direction from here is upward. And by from here, I mean the first quarter beginning April 2021 to June 2021. I'm not talking about the calendar, January 21 to March 21. We expect that to also decline. So the direction is important. However, your question is still valid. okay, the direction is positive. When will that direction lead to a position that exceeds the position we were in 2019? And the indications, Chris, are that that will take us a few years. That could take anywhere between 2 and 4 years, somewhere within that range. Clearly, you can do the math. If you go from 100 to 90, 3% growth will take you to 92.7. And then another 3% might take you, I'm giving you rough figures here, it might take you to 95. Another 3%, or 96, or just under 96. Another 3% might take you to 98 or 99. And another 3% will take you over. So what we're going to need to do is to keep that up. And within a period of 2 to 4 years, we are likely, very likely, to retain the levels of 2019. We may get a positive surprise, and as some of the ranges that have been quoted by the BOJ are very wide, from 3 all the way to 5, or to 8 rather. And so we could get a positive surprise that it's actually higher than the 3. Let's wait and see. The bigger risk, I would say, is not in the, so here I'm speaking on the assumption that we are at the beginning of the end of the pandemic with the arrival of vaccines in Jamaica in April of 2021, right? And that we begin our rollout then, and the rollout of in the world gathers pace according to expectations as we have them today. That is an underlying assumption. With that assumption, we expect, as I mentioned, that it will take 2 to 4 years to get to beyond October 2019. But the risk is not so much in the short term. In the Jamaica specific case, it is more in not year 1 of recovery or year 2 of recovery. It's like year 3 of recovery, when we're going to need the microeconomic reforms to chip in, because we can no longer sort of depend on kind of the bounce back that preserving stability has allowed us to achieve. You understand? For year 3, you're going to need the microeconomic reforms to kind of kick in the way that our transaction tax reforms, right? That, I believe everybody would definitely agree. The transaction tax reforms and the monetary policy reforms that brought interest rates down would account for the explosion in private sector construction that you can see with your naked eye. We're going to need equivalent microeconomic changes where other sectors can go through similar massive changes in output.
Great. No, thanks for that. Comprehensive again. Minister Clark, what would your message be to the rating agencies who doubt the economy's buoyancy and expect the negative impact of the pandemic to dampen growth in the long term?
Let me just respond to the premise of the question. I mean, the rating agencies have kept Jamaica's ratings intact. S&P has reaffirmed our B+ rating, and they have an outlook, obviously. And in their detailed document, what they said is there's expectation from all these forecasting agencies that growth will be in the region of 3% or 2% or thereabouts. And if that is not maintained, or if that does not materialize, then they would have to take a rating decision. That's what they said. So they have given Jamaica the benefit of the doubt thus far. There are many other countries where the letter rating has been downgraded already. For Jamaica, again, the worst crisis in 100 years, our B+ rating has remained unchanged 9 months into the crisis. And that is a very positive thing. Obviously, we're going to have to continue, right? We're not out of the woods by any means. But acknowledging that, I think, is very important.
Absolutely, and that's certainly the highest rating I've known Jamaica to have in
the highest rating in 20 years, the highest rating
decades.
Since we started rating.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Gary, love to hear from you. You've been quiet so far.
Thank you, Dan. Minister, one of the things as I travel Jamaica and I've heard is what's the metric, what's the parameter that you use to determine which sector you're going to assist, because every sector is in need of assistance at this point in time, you know. And so for the people out there, you know, what are the sectors that, you know, you as Minister of Finance are minded to assist? What are the other sectors that you believe they have resources to help themselves? And finally, what are those main sectors that with some incentive or some assistance can help Jamaica to get back to the 3% or potentially higher growth?
Okay, so you will recall that in the response to the crisis, you know, I set out very early in March a set of principles that will guide how we respond to the crisis. You know, you can't always see the future, but if you are grounded in principles, you have the framework for your decision making, regardless of what the circumstances are. And one of the central principles that we outlined at the very beginning is that we won't be able to subsidize profits. We don't have the money for that. But what we will do is subsidize people. And so our response provided support to people from many, many industries. We provided support, and if I were to name them, it would probably take me 5 minutes, but we provided support for persons who are, you know, hairdressers and barbers and market vendors and craft vendors and taxi operators and juta drivers. We provided support for people in the tourism sector, people in the horse racing sector. We used to provide support for fishermen and people in agriculture. We provide support for people in entertainment, for the disabled community. We used to provide support for students and the elderly. We provide support for children on path, and that support came in the form of cash and laptops. So the support was broad-based across people working in many sectors. But what it had in common is that we supported people. And rarely, and I don't think, and we have not, apart from the program where we provided grants for small and medium-sized businesses, we have not directed our support to the subsidy of profits. What we are driving towards in Jamaica is a market-based economy where the allocation of resources is determined by competitive market forces, and where solutions to problems are also market-driven. So in the same private sector, we have institutions and high net worth individuals. There's a lot of capital, and that capital has been through market forces, has been finding homes. We have had, this year, I believe, I haven't tabulated the figures, but this year has been a record year, or near record, in issuances on the Jamaica Stock Exchange, either through primary offers or through secondary offers, which everybody calls APOs. We have seen a record amount of capital being raised, and that's exactly what you want. A market economy where the solutions are in the private marketplace, where you have private market provider providing capital in the form of debt or equity or quasi-equity to a private market business. And the role of the government is to preserve the institutional stability that benefits all of us, and to continue to reform the economy on the micro side to ensure that opportunity abounds. So we're not going to pick sectors, Gary. We want a competitive economy, and where, businesses can thrive, and you as an entrepreneur, you as a provider of capital, you determine where is likely to be most profitable for you and what risks you want to bear.
So speaking about supporting the competitive economy, Minister, I think it's well within the government's power and plans in terms of divestment opportunities. Could you talk to us about plans in the near future, more divestment opportunities to give the market a better chance to operate businesses efficiently and be more inclusive in terms of folks who participate in those businesses in a more efficient manner?
So the government's divestment program was very active over the last 4 years. You'd have seen divestment through modalities, through PPPs. We privatized the Kingston Container Terminal. We privatized the Norman Manley International Airports. All of these in the last 4 years. We privatized, and we concluded on the sale of Petcom, and that was by a privately negotiated transaction. We concluded on the sale of coffee interest, and that was privately negotiated. So that's the second modality, PPP and private negotiation. And towards the end of the last term, you saw the third modality, which was through IPOs. And we had the IPO, which was managed by Mayberry, and was an extremely successful IPO of Wigton Wind Farm. And we had also had the IPO of Trans-Jamaica Highway. So 6 very high-profile divestments over the past 4 years, and there were quite a few smaller ones. Now, as you know, Mayberry, having managed the Wigton divestment on behalf of the government of Jamaica, it involves a lot of work and a lot of organization. And our priorities sort of shifted in the pandemic to respond and to absorb the crisis, and therefore the pipeline and the timeline was shifted. But the government of Jamaica remains firmly committed to continuing its divestment program, and we had previously announced the divestment of the government's interest in JPS, as well as the privatization of the Jamaica Mortgage Bank. And there are a number of other initiatives, such as the Soapberry Waste Management Plant. There are a number of infrastructure opportunities that are going to come down the pipeline. But those, the timeline has just been shifted, just out of 2020 and hopefully into 2021, or maybe shortly thereafter, as we sort of get the mental space to focus on them. But privatizations are a key part of the government's policy platform going forward.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Minister. Really appreciate that. The pandemic has brought its challenges, but also a myriad of opportunities that Jamaica has yet to capitalize on. Though we commend the GOJ's intentions to reduce asset tax payable by specified regulated entities, what is preventing the GOJ from abolishing asset tax? Isn't the GOJ more apprehensive about missed business opportunities caused by the asset tax?
As you corner me between Gary and Dan, and then you ask the question. You will recall in the last budget that we slashed the asset tax on payable by banks by 50%, and then the pandemic hit. And as a part of our response in the first supplementary, with the support of the financial community, we clawed it back. The cost of it was about $3 billion, and we repurposed those funds, and that was absolutely necessary. But by passing a budget that contemplated the reduction in asset tax by 50%, I think it's very clear where the government's policy intent is. I've said, and I'm on record of saying, that the asset tax for financial institutions is not a sensible tax. It has the impact of increasing the cost of capital to businesses and to individuals, and therefore it works against the public interest. In order to reduce it, we have to have the fiscal space, and time will tell when we can have that fiscal space in order to reduce it. But the government of Jamaica is of the firm view that that tax needs to go as soon as we can find the space. And not for the benefit of financial institutions and their bottom line at all, for the benefit of their consumers and customers. Because ultimately, those charges, that tax, what happens, and I'm explaining to your viewers and investors and citizens of Jamaica, what ultimately happens with that tax is that financial institutions, banks and insurance companies and broker-dealers, they just pass it on to you, the consumer. They just increase the cost of their services to you, cost of loans, fees that they charge. And therefore, everybody is worse off. But what is even more deleterious, what is even a greater negative impact from the asset tax, is that financial institutions move assets out of Jamaica. Because when the assets are out of Jamaica, they don't attract the asset tax. Now, everybody at home, I think, can see for yourself that that's not good for Jamaica. So many times persons speak about asset tax or a removal of it as something that benefits the financial institutions. That's not the case. Removing it would bring assets back onshore to Jamaica, which benefits us all, and would have the effect of reducing costs to citizens and consumers. And the government is committed to reducing asset tax as soon as the fiscal space allows us to do so.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. Thank you for that, Minister. We appreciate that. Mr. Berry, any thoughts from your questions?
Yes, Dan. I have a follow-up question for the minister. So I noted in his presentation that 70% of the economy was services. And this afternoon, by chance, I was speaking to, Dan, are you hearing me?
Absolutely.
Yes, I was speaking to a young entrepreneur, and he's involved in the creative arts, and he uses a lot of technology. And he was saying, and you know, I don't think it's an accident why so many Jamaicans are involved in services. In my own case, in our own family business, we realized pretty early on in our family that we didn't have a lot of capital. So if we sold services, we could build up some capital. So it's a common thing for most Jamaicans trying to get ahead, because you get a good education, you can sell services. But he said to me, Minister, that every piece of his equipment that he purchases from B&H, photo and computer in New York City, by the time it reaches to Jamaica, it costs 50% more. And I think this is not only affecting this youngster in services, I think it's affecting all Jamaican companies and their ability to compete in the international market. I think these taxes load up the cost of the companies and it makes them non-competitive. And in a sense, you're killing yourself because you're taxing capital before capital makes profit. And if I'm a big international investor looking at Jamaica and I have a chance to go to a country that's taxing me upfront and one that's not, then I'm gonna pick the one that's not taxing me upfront. Now, I know this is a major thing. The whole tax structure is in Jamaica is structured like that, but I personally believe it's a big deterrent to growth. And I just want to hear your comments on it.
Yeah, I totally understand the question and the views being expressed. The structure of Jamaica's revenue is such that we derive a significant portion of our revenue, right? That, you know, pays for teachers and nurses and fixes roads and makes the wheels of government turn from customs. Right? Our border revenue represents 30%, 40% of our overall tax revenue that we derive at the border. So until we can derive revenue from other sources, the ability to completely and dramatically change how revenue is collected at the border remains stymied. And I give you an example, Chris. You know, corporate taxation in Jamaica yields in the 50s of billion. I can't remember exactly, but let's call it 60 billion. And the vast majority of that, right, only comes from the top 200, 300 firms. Until we are able to increase our corporate tax take without increasing the rate, which would be counterproductive, to a much larger amount, right, then we will continue to rely on our border taxation. And so it's just a matter, if we could reduce border taxes from what they are now and slash them, we would. You've seen the attitude that this government has taken towards taxation that impedes economic activity. But the simple thing is that the simple fact is that we depend, as an open economy, we depend on border taxation for our revenue. Now, the structure of taxation in the United States as an example, or in the UK is very, very different. And I should pull the figures up and release the comparative, where their structure is that border taxation would not be as significant to their revenue authorities, relatively speaking, as it is to us. And it's just how we are structured in Jamaica. So the ability to reduce it significantly will depend on our ability to reap that revenue from other sources or from other areas growing, so that the government can, corporate profit grows, and so we can earn more tax from corporate profits. By way of an example, just one tax type which this community would understand and be paying attention to. However, having said that, there are a number of avenues in place that I want to share. The first is that to relieve the burden somewhat. The first is that the taxation laws allow for capital allowance on capital goods. So, an accelerated capital allowance as well. So I would advise your entrepreneur in the services sector to consult, their tax advisors, because the law allows, if you buy a piece of equipment for $50,000, I'm making a number up here, for 10,000 US dollars, and it's a capital equipment, you are able to write off that capital equipment in an accelerated fashion and use it as a hedge against profits that would otherwise attract tax. Okay? So there the government provides an incentive for you to acquire capital goods and for you to write off those costs in an accelerated fashion and get a tax benefit as a result. In addition, I know for many sectors, capital goods that are imported in order to make their products, those capital goods enjoy some kind of relief. And I would again sort of advise your client to consult their tax advisors to see whether or not that particular structure could apply to their operation, where capital goods used in this, to produce their services would benefit from some kind of border taxation relief. I'm not saying that it does, but I'm advising you to consult the tax advice. So what we're seeing, Chris, if I may say, is that as we reform our economy and as we create a market-driven economy, right, it is a sophisticated, it requires a level of sophistication to operate optimally. And there's no getting away from that. And that's why we have to continue to invest in education and to provide the DBJ with the facilities where they can bring entrepreneurs up the ladder. Because you need to understand, right, the tax laws. And you need to understand how you can benefit and how things ought to be recorded in order to get ahead and to optimize. So I wouldn't be surprised that many persons, especially medium-sized businesses, probably have capital equipment that they have purchased and they just simply expense it. Not simply expense it, sorry. And they don't get the benefits that the government offers from the acquisition of capital equipment. And so, I think our tax advisors per capita is probably far smaller than in developed markets, and that's by definition. But we're going to have to encourage our medium-sized businesses and our entrepreneurs and so forth to seek out avenues. And that's a business opportunity, a service business opportunity for professionals. And I believe it's a growth opportunity for professionals to provide tax advice and accounting services to the growing medium-sized business space.
Thank you for that, Minister. We see the questions coming in live from social media. Mrs. R. Flex asks, as a follow-up to the chairman's question, somewhat related, will we see the Customs Act increase the duty-free threshold from $50 to $100?
I suspect that would come. Look, that is something that we're looking at absolutely seriously. I've listened and I've heard. I've seen the comments on social media. I've seen the questions asked on many fora, and I want you to know that we are listening to you. And right now, I have a team that's looking into that. I want you to understand that there are many things that would go into a decision such as that. And as Minister of Finance and the Public Service, I have a fiduciary responsibility to look at a matter like that holistically. There is the perspective of the person who is importing and who is doing a lot of importation of small valued items and is inconvenienced from having to pay duties on those items. I totally get it and I totally understand it. We have to look at revenues overall, and that's always a feature. So we're doing analysis to see, what is the revenue contribution from small value imports, okay? And that has to be a part of the analysis. Another part of the analysis has to be that you heard me mention earlier, that the retail trade broadly defined, right? What Statin calls wholesale retail, which includes everything from retail of goods and supermarkets and traditional wholesales to garages, to people who sell motor vehicles, to people who sell auto parts, to people who sell equipment. Right? When you go down a high street on May Pen, and I use the word high street, but you know what I mean, all of those stores that occupy every high street in Jamaica, right? Those constitute the retail space. It's the largest part of the economy. And I cannot make a move that destroys that sector just like that, right? Because people are gravitating towards e-commerce. We have to be mindful that the retail space represents the largest part of the Jamaican economy, the largest. And any move we make has to be a move that preserves retail as a viable business in Jamaica. So we're looking at it, and I give you my commitment that you will hear me speak about it definitively in the not too distant future. But I need to look at it holistically and looking at all avenues of it, which is my fiduciary obligation to all the people of Jamaica.
Thank you, Mr. Comprehensive, as usual. Final question from my list of questions before we move on to our top picks. What major infrastructure projects does the country have confirmed to take place in the next 5 years?
Okay. So the government's infrastructure program, is very well developed. The COVID pandemic obviously has shifted timeline somewhat, but you would have heard the Prime Minister speak in Parliament about the plans to connect all major towns in Jamaica by highways. We have a South Coast improvement project, which is going to expand the highway or create a highway from Kingston all the way to Port Antonio. The first 16 miles from Harborview will be a 4-lane highway, and after that 16 miles, you'll have a highway like exists for most of the North Coast Highway, which is just 2 lanes, all the way to Port Antonio. That's going to open up the eastern segment of the island for construction, for home development, and for residential development, and will change the westward expansion, into Spanish Town and to St. Catherine. You're going to see developments along the east with easier commute into Kingston. The South Coast Highway is also going to expand the Southern Coast Highway all the way to Williamsfield. So it's going to bring you right to the outskirts of Mandeville, which will make the commute to Mandeville substantially lower, and commute obviously to Western Jamaica. There are plans further afoot that involve potentially over $1 billion of investment to connect major towns and to provide ring roads around all the major North Coast towns. As you know, commuting across, and let me say, the North Coast Highway, which was developed by previous administrations, paved the way for an expansion in the tourism product that we've seen over the past 10 years, and especially over the past 5 years. We want to ensure that we make further infrastructure investments that will usher in even more expansion in the future. And those investments will allow for persons to bypass the major towns, which today are a source of congestion. So in no order of importance or in order of implementation, We all know that going through Notta Bay and going through Lucy in Hanover and going through, well, let me talk about Mobay as a special case, right? But going through all of those towns, you're held up. And the idea is that we want to be able to, traverse, but when you're out to the towns, you traverse freely. We want to traverse freely and be able to bypass all of these major towns, which will cut the commute time from Port Antonio to Montego Bay significantly. There is the Montego Bay bypass, which we've seen recent news. The Montego Bay Chamber of Commerce and right has come out insisting that it happens, and the government is way ahead, right? We are the ones who have advanced this initiative, and we are going to go to market with it, hopefully in the next fiscal year, and that will involve massive investment in Montego Bay, and again, making the commute time through Montego Bay a fraction of what it is today. So you're going to see major, over the next several years, major sort of infrastructure work on roads and on highways, but there'll be other things as well. The National Water Commission needs to spend over, and here I am not the minister responsible for water, but here I'm speaking as the minister responsible for the capital budget of the country. There's over, $30 billion of there, and we're going to see that the government is going to need to spend on infrastructure, or if not spend, have others carry out that expenditure. So yes, you put the nail on the head. Infrastructure is going to be a critical part of the government's program over the medium term. And that's not new. That has been announced before, and the pandemic, we'll not allow the pandemic to hold that up.
Thank you, Minister. I appreciate that. Gary, final question to you before we go into the topics, if you will.
Thanks. Minister, when I hear you speak and I hear the questions, I think every day you get up, you're thinking about the chicken and the egg. People want you to reduce the taxes, but they don't tell you how you're going to replace it.
Yes.
So my question is pretty simple. The country benefited from having $80 billion warehoused before the pandemic, but the majority of those funds have been expended.
Yes.
We're going into 2021, and no pun intended, but the revenues for 2021 could be seen as a lottery from the perspective of when will it come back in a meaningful way. And obviously, if it doesn't come back as projected, those shortfalls. So my question becomes the chicken and the egg. We're going into a recovery period. And obviously, new taxes would not be something anybody in the country would want to see. But again, there's that countervailing issue of having to have revenue to take care of expenditure. So for 2021, on a balance of probability, what's the probability of no new taxes?
Right. So, I can't give it all away here.
You could.
Well, let me say, I don't intend to give it all away here.
No, that's different.
But let me just say a few things. One,
No new taxes.
All of the agencies responsible for economic growth projections are projecting growth for next year. Yes. So you can expect that will be a feature of our planning. And, revenues grow by your underlying real growth, and they also grow by your projected inflation amount. So we'll have a growth in revenues next year, no doubt. We're going to have to prioritize what we spend on, and our priorities obviously are going to be to ensure that we recover as soon as possible. Key to recovery is ensuring a healthy population, and so we're going to have to find that money for the vaccines that the Minister of Health spoke about, and that has to be a priority. But there are other things that we'll be working on, and you have to pay attention and keep your dial tuned in, and everything will be revealed in due course. But let me say that we have every reason to be optimistic, Chris, Gary, and Dan, that in the midst of the greatest crisis that we've ever seen, Jamaica has showed deep resilience and has absorbed the crisis and maintained our stability, and we are ready to rebound in 2021, provided that the health side of the pandemic, in terms of making sure that people are inoculated and inoculation or vaccination begins in April of 2021. So I would say to you, every reason to be optimistic, and I leave you again with that fact I've mentioned twice before, that in the middle of the pandemic, the construction sector, which is a services sector, increased by 7%. That should tell you a whole lot. And you understand and have seen the disposition of this government towards policy matters, and you can take that disposition and understand the framework that we will bring to allocation of resources and solving the problems that we have at this point in time.
Thank you, Minister. Really appreciate that. The insights are invaluable, and we look forward to the upcoming budget announcements where the Minister intimated it, no new taxes. I said it, he didn't.
I did.
I said it, he didn't. So we talked about infrastructure and development, and it takes me to my top pick for this week. It's obviously, for me, clear to my mind, it's got to be Lumber Depot. So we're talking about a stock that currently trades at about $1.53 with a PE ratio that's only 10 times in a market where the average PE ratio is about 22 times, in an industry that the minister said is growing, and you heard about the commitment to infrastructure development going forward. So I personally really think Lumber Depot is a great buy. I'm expecting that stock price to double over the next 12 to 18 months, and the construction industry will continue to boom, and Lumber Depot will continue to do their thing. So that's my top pick this week.
I would just add, Dan, that it's a company that Mayberry has a position, or Mayberry Jamaican Equities has a material position.
There you go, and that didn't bias my pick, I assure you. It's one that I really enjoy. So folks, go out yourself and get some more Lumber Depot. Really enjoyed having you with us this week, Minister. Chairman Berry, again, having you with us virtually. Mr. Parrott, having you. I'd like to also show you folks what the top gainers this week were, and also the top decliners. So our top gainers, as you can see, shown on the screen, are Purity, 138, and ISP. And we also have First Rock, I believe.
Yeah.
And our top decliners, B Powell, MIL, Key, QWI, and JP. Of course, I'm excited about the market. We saw 5 APOs/IPOs, so we think the market's really coming back strong, and I think supported by the minister's plan, his administration's plan, we think things are going to do very well. So we're going to wrap up in a few minutes, but we might have 1 or 2 social media questions that we'd like to entertain before we close up to give you folks a chance. First one that I have, Leslie, can I see that on screen? There you go, I'm looking at the wrong place. More Earl, I can never read this stuff, ask on Instagram, in relation to the customs revenue point raised by Mr. Berry, are there other sources of revenue being explored? Minister, that's for you.
That's for me?
Yes. In relation to customs revenue point raised by Mr. Berry, are there other sources of revenue being explored?
Well, I mean, the revenue of government, you can break it down into 3 categories. There's what we call revenue that's derived from income, and from all sources of income, from personal income, where you have PAYE for persons who are employed. You have income, corporate income tax. You have income on interest. You have income on dividends. You have taxes. Sorry, on interest, taxes on dividends. So taxes from income generally. Then you have taxes from production and consumption, and that's where you get levies on bauxite, for example, or taxes on the environmental levy, or you get the GCT and other forms of consumption, production and consumption taxes. And then you have what I described earlier, the border taxes at the border collected by the customs agency. Those are the three categories. What I was alluding to earlier is that, in order to fundamentally, for Jamaica to have a border taxation regime that is like what you have in the United States, and United States is obviously a huge giant of an economy, very advanced state, so there's no comparison between the two. But just to say that we're going to need our economy to grow in diversity and in structure, to be deepened, and for the other sources, right? The sources on income and production and consumption to grow for us to be able to make sweeping changes on the border-related taxation. That doesn't mean we can't, do a little twist here or there. But I was trying to use the opportunity to just make a fundamental point and bring your viewers into a consciousness of the structure of government revenues.
Understood. And last one from social media, because folks, apologies, but we're out of time. On Instagram, we've got a question. Will there be any support for the entertainment industry? And if so, when?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The entertainment industry is one of the hardest hit industries. Obviously, entertainment is in the service economy. And after tourism, it's probably, I would say, one of the hardest hit. Normally we have thousands of permits that are issued on an annual basis. I believe permits have dwindled to zero over the past several months in order to abide by COVID distancing protocol. The Minister of Entertainment, the Honorable Babsy Grange, has been a key advocate for the entertainment industry, and their support has been provided. In an amount of $40 million or thereabouts for entertainment practitioners, and I know that she's assiduously working to get in that support to the industry. I know that it could easily be a lot more, and we continue to work with Minister Grange's ministry to see what we'll be able to do in the next fiscal year.
Thanks for that, Minister. To our viewers, thank you all for being a part of our very first virtual forum for the year. I'd like to thank Mr. Berry, Mr. Peart, and particularly Nigel Clark, Minister Clark, for being with us and for participating in today's investor briefing. We're certainly looking forward to having yet another insightful discussion in the coming week. Be sure to follow us on social media as we look forward to our special guest next week, Mr. Ian Deere, the Chairman and CEO of Express Catering Limited. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Mayberry Investments. And thank you to all our viewers for tuning in today, for all of those folks who joined us online, on Facebook, on Instagram. It was great to have you. And remember, wise investors, Gary?
Slow and steady wins the race.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.